France is pressing ahead with what's being called an unprecedented attack on Islam. There is a law going through Parliament to put the brakes on what France calls Islamic separatism, following a number of murderous attacks. This is Roundtable. I'm David Foster. Very good to have your company. Is this about votes and winning popular support ahead of crucial national elections, or does France have the right to defend what it calls its natural values?
In October last year, the French President Emmanuel Macron set out his vision for a new law to fight what he calls Islamist separatism. After terrorist attacks in France and elsewhere in Europe, Macron says he's targeting extremism and defending the values of the Republic. But many Muslims in France feel they're being stigmatized, and the proposals have been criticized in Muslim-majority countries around the world. In a recent book, France's Interior Minister Gérald Darmanin likened Islamist separatism to what he called a fragmentation bomb targeting our society. And in a television debate last week, Darmanin defended the government's approach as he clashed with the far-right leader Marine Le Pen. She accused the government of not tackling radicalism and instead restricting religious freedoms for all. The next presidential election is in April of 2022, and the treatment of France's Muslims remains a hot political topic. But is the extremism law really about reinforcing French values, or is it about gaining support at the ballot box?
Well, since this is a subject to which we are returning, we welcome back to Roundtable our three guests on today's programme. Dr. Joseph Downing, Fellow at London School of Economics, expert in French politics. We say hello again to Nabila Ramdani, award-winning French-Algerian journalist who specialises in French politics, Islamic affairs and the Arab world. And Philippe Marlier, here with us too, Professor of French and European Politics at University College London. Normally we start the programme with a conversation, but I'm going to bring up a graphic here which illustrates three of the points that are inside this controversial bill, and I'd like you, each one of you in turn, to discuss them. The first point is that all children from the age of 3 have to attend regular schools, concerns about what are known as clandestine schools. Point 2, oversight of religious associations and places of worship, including mosques. And number 3, a clampdown on foreign financing of religion. Do you have a problem, Nabila, with the first one about all children under 3 going to school regularly and the fact that there might be these clandestine schools?
Well, it has to be said that Macron's draft law targeting radical Islamism, as he put it, followed a spate of demonic terrorist attacks that propagandists have been very keen to blame on some 5 million Muslims living in France. And the preposterous idea is that you can spread collective guilt for evil acts carried out by a tiny minority of criminals who in many cases...
With due respect, Nabila, these are the points we went into last time. I'm trying to drill down into the specifics of the bill. Children from the age of 3 have to go to school, regular school, because the French authorities are worried about clandestine schools.
Well, this comes at a time when everybody is encouraged to stay at home because of a global pandemic. And yet we're hearing the President of France pointing fingers and in effect stigmatizing a community, not least of all small children, by branding the schools clandestine and in fact implying that they are a problem within French society. It's not the first time that Mr. Macron have made such distasteful accusations against French Muslims, not least of all small girls. Remember how he peddled fake news about young girls as small as 4 years old, allegedly clad in burqas in France. Now, I can assure you, if there was a single incident of a small girl wearing a burqa in France, it would be front page news story and the world would have heard about it. As it happens, I have made calls to the French authorities, not least of all the French prosecutors and the Interior Ministry. There was not a single incident of a parent or anyone forcing a child wearing a burqa. And so this attempt to portray small children's, Muslim children, as a problem in France is it's quite unimpressive from the President of France.
Okay, you won't go into the specifics of it. I'm going to ask for generalizations from you, Philippe, if you would, on those 3 points. And then there are some other ones that I want to bring up. What do you make of the generalities of this bill?
I think in theory, there's nothing wrong about expecting children to attend school. But I would say there's no such thing in France as systemic clandestine schooling across the board. If there are parents who do that, it's isolated cases and they break the law. And again, as Nabila was saying earlier, why put the blame on one specific group, i.e. Muslims in France? So I think, again, that's a bit of a weird way. And also it comes at a time...
This applies to everybody. It doesn't just apply to Muslims, or even though that is the headline that we get.
It applies to everyone in theory, but we know very well that implicitly the population which is being targeted are Muslims. But I should add to the sort of current situation where, of course, people are expected to stay at home, which is sort of a bizarre. But let's assume that when things get to normal, I think there are very big issues for the government, notably in terms of funding education and schooling in France in general, starting with nurseries and primary education. We know that schools there are understaffed, underfunded. So again, they need really to put the money where the mouth is. And clearly, if it's not simply some political gesticulation, they will have really to foot the bill and pay for that.
Well, if some of the money that is lacking at the moment is being provided by people outside the country who may have ulterior motives, and that is one reason. I'll come to you on this one, Joseph, perhaps for clamping down on foreign financing of religion.
Well, this is fascinating. To me, this point about the foreign financing of religion and about radicalization through NGOs or through mosques, to me seems a very out-of-date paradigm when we consider radicalization and terrorism in France. There's no evidence that any of the recent terrorists were radicalized in a mosque in France, for example, right? Across Europe, communities have been very active in pushing radicals and people involved in violence out of mosques. The Cauchy brothers that committed the Charlie Hebdo atrocity, for example, were said to have radicalized in a park in Paris where they practiced martial arts with other people of a violent radical bent. To me, this just seems a bit like a model that's out of date by about 20 years, and there is little evidence from what I can see.
Joseph, sorry for interrupting. You cannot be certain that all forms of radicalization have been expunged from mosques or other religious institutions, and therefore, if you have a blanket law that prevents that from happening, that is better than allowing it possibly to develop into something much more insidious, perhaps.
Well, yeah, in a sense, but if there's not a significant problem there to begin with, do we not risk then duplicating laws and adding complexity to an already highly complex environment that may actually hamper efforts at counter-radicalization, or indeed it may put the legal focus on particular institutions and a particular model of radicalization that is no longer relevant, right? Why is this law not dealing with things like online access to online information, access to online sources of radicalization, the regulation of apps on phones that allow you to have anonymous channels that we know organizations like ISIS have used extensively? That for me would be a much more important avenue that the French government should be tackling.
And that's missing, is it?
Yeah. It's missing because it's very difficult to deal with, right? And that's the problem with this issue and the way that it's been presented in this particular law. They're kind of like own goals in a sense, right? You set up this straw man that there's a problem, and it enables you to deliver on it quite easily because there's no problem in the beginning, right? A bit like both Philippe and Nabila said about this question of schooling. Like, there are already laws that say children have to go to school. So why do we need another law that says children have to go to school? To me, seems bizarre.
Let's go through another couple of these ones. Less contentious, I would say. Maybe you disagree. Nabila, you first of all. Doctors fined €15,000 and a prison sentence of up to a year for providing virginity certificates.
Well, can I put this bill into context? I think it's important. I think it says everything that Macron's bill was originally called the anti-separatism bill, a term that Macron used to refer to radical Islamists withdrawing from mainstream society. Now, following criticism of that term, it's now called a draft law to strengthen Republican values, mostly secularism and freedom of expression. But dare I say, these are merely rhetorical tweaks that have not stopped the Macron administration proposing much stricter controls on Muslims. And this is what it's all about. These range from tougher rules on the funding of religious organizations and closer monitoring of the perceived enemy within. And the emphasis is always on increased security and the usual crackdowns on those who show off their religious affiliation.
So would you suggest that these laws are being introduced? And I'm going to go through three here. The one about virginity certificates being illegal, a ban against polygamy, no residence permit if you practice it, and suspected forced marriages could be referred to a prosecutor. Do you think that all of those are determined simply to be aimed at the Islamic community?
Well, there is legislation in France, and there I say ample legislation in France to deal with all sorts of abuse against women. So there is no need to create specific legislation aimed at stigmatizing Muslim communities per se. If women are treated appallingly, then the law exists to deal with it, and that dare I say it covers all women from all walks of life, from all faiths. So I think the government insistence that Muslim women are a problem and that the state should interfere in the most sinister manner possible to control even the genitals, dare I say, is frankly the worst form of control over a woman's body.
Well, to some extent, they are not controlling the genitals; they're stopping other people from controlling the genitals. I think that's a fair point. Let's hear from Marine Le Pen, who's president of the party, the Rassemblement National.
À aucun niveau de l'État.
At no level of the state did they visibly understand that the Islamist offensive was not part of isolated skirmishes of fanatical groups, but of a total war being waged against us. This war, it must be admitted, is global. We are in fact facing the first global war of the 21st century.
There we have Marine Le Pen saying it is a war, it's a global war. Do you think that is a complete falsehood?
Well, Marine Le Pen is the leader of the Rassemblement National and the politician likely to be Macron's main rival for the presidency in 2022. And she's not just the daughter of the convicted racist, anti-Semite and Islamophobe Jean-Marie Le Pen. She's also notorious for her antipathy towards Muslims herself. And she has made let's put it very bluntly, she's a rabble-rouser who is quite used to Muslim baiting in public, and she held a very public, debate last week only on primetime television, where she was allowed to pour out her prejudices against Muslim communities, and you would have noticed that Islam and Islamists were used interchangeably.
Well, also the Interior Minister, Gérald Darmanin, I think it was in the same program, he described the fragmentation bomb of our society. I've mentioned that earlier in the program, and he said it was such a dangerous and insidious enemy. The question now, and this is what we're boiling down to, is why are both sides in this debate, and I'm sure there are much more even-keeled people in France, but two sides of the debate that are very prominent. Why are they both painting it this way? Is it simply to get votes, Joseph?
Well, to me, this is an issue that is very easy to win on, right? If you're a French politician, Macron is looking at this situation knowing the left in France don't like him and the left aren't going to vote for him, right? He knows that he's got to compete with Marine Le Pen for votes. If he comes out again and talks about issues in the labour market, issues of unemployment, quest for reform, this eternal quest for reform of the French system, these are issues he can't win on, and that he actually promised to win on in his last campaign and has not delivered on. And that to me seems a key point as to why both him and his interior minister have tacked right on this to challenge Marine Le Pen. And as someone that's done more than a decade of first-hand research on French Muslims and French society, France is very well integrated. Muslims are very well integrated, but there are also many white French people who are disintegrated in terms of belonging to far left, anarchist, and violent far right groups. Why are these groups not being more evenly addressed by politicians in the public sphere? Why are we not talking about an issue with a disintegrated society of anarchists, leftists, and people that are in far right groups? That to me is a bit of a problem.
I'm sure we will in other programs, but we're talking about this, and I do get your point. Philippe, I want to ask you, the point raised there by Joseph is that both sides have to appeal to the extreme far right if they're going to either win power or to stay in power. If Macron and Darmanin and the others of the French government are doing this to keep Marine Le Pen out, isn't that a better result for Muslims in France than the alternative?
I think Macron is playing a very dangerous game because, yes, a year ahead of the next presidential election, where he hopes, of course, to run again and win it as incumbent president, is saying all around, and his government does the same, that the only major opponent to him is the far right. Maybe, but of course, it's also a political construction in a sense that if by having an only opponent, which is the far right, the government at the moment is in fact going very much along a lot of the far right themes. And you referred to the Darmanin-Le Pen debate on national TV, on France 2, which is the equivalent of the BBC, where you had the interior minister arguing, one, that Le Pen was too soft on Islam, and I quote Darmanin here, and also that some of the provisions contained in this most controversial law on separatism had been drafted in order, and I quote again, to please the far right. So, of course, this is, I believe, playing with fire, because if you go along all the themes, the rhetoric, the policy, which Le Pen, father and daughter, have been repeating on and on for the past 40 years. Of course, in the end, the public might assume that, why not vote for the original and not the carbon copy of that? Because in the end, it's not two competing camps. You've got in government people who are sounding exactly like, far-right politicians. And I think this is something unheard of in French politics. And it is very bizarre because it leads to a lot of political, policy, ideological confusion, and who knows might come out of that.
And Nabila, you seem to think that Darmanin's got an eye on the presidency in the future anyway, and that he may be playing to this with the rhetoric.
Yes, very much so. He definitely has ambitions of his own to become president of France one day. And he's at the moment arguably the most far-right interior minister in decades, which is saying something. And as Philippe said, can you imagine accusing Le Pen of being soft on Islam? So, there is absolutely no doubt at all that all the major parties and indeed the candidates hoping to become president of France, especially next year, are peddling a deeply cynical narrative aimed at attracting far-right voters. This target demographic is always crucial at a presidential election time. It isn't big enough to elect a president, but it is certainly big enough to provide enough votes in the second round to get a second choice candidate into power.
But Nabila, if they are using this kind of language, aren't they doing it to appeal to people who already have those same kind of sentiments? This conversation is already going on in France.
Well, the truth is that the official values of French society are, of course, extremely enlightened. In theory, they embrace liberty, equality, and fraternity, no matter what your beliefs or background. And the idea that secularism excludes religion is, for example, a myth. But in reality, as we know all very well, the French Republic certainly doesn't live up to its values. And millions of French people have been voting for the far right for decades, for example, and particularly for the National Front, a party that grew out of the fight against decolonization and which recently became the Rassemblement National. So the party reflects all kinds of bigoted positions, including towards anyone from an Arab and indeed a Muslim background. And there I say, thanks to often compliant media, Islam is regularly presented as a problem by politicians and indeed agenda-led commentators who pop up on TV all the time to project brown-skinned Muslims as undesirables. So all of this, of course, contributes to influence French society as a whole.
Joseph, is there no alternative? Is it a choice between Marine Le Pen and the far-right party she leads, or between other politicians who espouse, as they say, more extreme views when it comes to immigration of Muslim, etc., etc.? Is there no third way, or indeed a second way, that the French people will be able to follow when it comes to the presidential elections?
Well, unfortunately, in 2022, it is actually looking quite unlikely, because the state of the French political field means that there's not been any real credible candidates to emerge out of any of the other main parties. I mean, even the Socialist Party contemplated not fielding a candidate for the presidential election in 2022, which is unheard of. So we're seeing this massive change to the alignments of the party structure in France that as of yet has not produced this kind of second or third way candidate. We've seen a loose alliance of left and green groups grab, the control of municipal seats like Marseille, but they've not translated that into a national agenda, and they've not given national figures that can contest national elections. So unfortunately for this election,
are you saying it's either extreme
so.
Macron Darmanin or it's extreme Marine Le Pen who we will see in the Elysee Palace?
I think so, because of just a lack of other credible alternatives at the moment. Frankly, this has come at quite a weird moment in French political history, I think.
Okay, Philippe, we're running out of time a little bit, but I'm going to throw the old question at you, and any of you others can also pick up if we still have time. If you are innocent, if you don't do anything wrong, if you keep your head down and are a proper member of society, you have nothing to fear from these laws.
I would say, why pass this new bill when, in fact, as we said earlier, all the provisions it contains are already established in laws, in other laws? And why do that? If not because you want to create a political situation in which one talks yet again about Muslims, about Islam, about the alleged inability of that population to fully integrate, to be absolute French citizens, to abide by the laws, to be sort of going along French lifestyle, Frenchness, all of that. I think that's really the problem. And why you do that, I think we've talked about it on this program, which is the context. I think the context isn't good for Macron. He's had a bad social movement against him, the Yellow Vest, you may remember, followed by a bad pandemic. I think he's not doing well. Vaccination program is not progressing very quickly. So I think he's got really to agitate, so to speak, the far right spectre and really make sure that people, the media, the voters really concentrate on that, because he believes that's his gamble, that his best chance to be reelected is to have Le Pen as an opponent. But that's a risky gamble, because a lot of the electorate who voted for him in 2017, the moderate voters, center-left, left, might not vote for him this time round.
Okay, so Nabila, we've only got about a minute left. The suggestion from Philippe is this is not about the laws. They will make no difference to the majority of people. It's simply about the conversation and whipping up anti-Muslim feeling. How does that go away?
Yes, I quite agree with that. In fact, everything you hear from the Elysee Palace, Macron and his administration in relation to Muslims is to present them as a security problem. His draft law.
How do you make that go away?
Well, let me point at a very specific example. There's never any mention when you talk about radicalism, for example, that the most recent atrocities carried out last year were by a Russian national, a Tunisian national, and a Pakistani national. Yet the poisonous narrative is that they were all the product of French Muslim communities, and that these communities are intrinsically a major problem of the secular French Republic.
Okay, very difficult to see how the conversation can be turned around, but perhaps programs like this, where you get to put your views out there, and other discussions in leading journals around the world, can perhaps make a difference. Listen, thank you very much indeed. It's been great to have all three of you back on this round table. Well, from me, David Foster, we thank you wherever you happen to be watching this program in these very strange times, and we hope you make the time to join us on our next edition of Roundtable. For now, goodbye.